Everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight for this artist talk for our exhibition, Take a Number, Artists and Bureaucracy. Tonight we have Chris Combs and Evan Hume together with Blair Murphy, our wonderful curator who organized this exhibition. There is a few housekeeping things to keep in mind. For the Q&A, we ask that you use the Q&A function. You'll see it at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A. Please use that to submit your questions and Blair will get to them throughout the talk. Blair?
Thank you so much, Katie. Thanks for everybody for being here tonight. I'm Blair Murphy. I'm the curator of exhibitions here at Arlington Arts Center. And if you're not familiar with AAC, if you're joining us from maybe somewhere else in the country, we are a nonprofit contemporary art space. We have an exhibitions program, an artist residency program, and an education program. So the talk tonight takes place in conjunction with one of our current exhibitions, which is called Take a Number, Artists and Bureaucracy, which is on view through December 18th. So we definitely encourage you, if you are in the Northern Virginia or the DC area, please do come see the show in person. We're open Wednesdays through Saturday, 12 to 5. We're doing a series of talks as part of the exhibition. So I'm happy to be here tonight with Chris Combs and Evan Hume, whose work is in, who both have work in the show. Next Thursday, November 18th at 6 p.m., we'll be talking with R.L. Martins and Sobia Ahmed, two other artists from the exhibition. And then on Saturday, November 20th, we'll be talking at 4 p.m. with Stephanie Mercedes and Pa S. Pescador, who are also in the exhibition, which the show focuses on artists whose work relates in some way to co-ops, explorers, bureaucracy. So there are a lot of interesting projects and interesting work in the exhibition. So do encourage people to come see it in person if they have the opportunity. So I am very happy to be joined tonight by Chris Combs and Evan Hume. I'm going to do a quick introduction, and then Chris and Evan are each going to give a brief introduction to their work in the show. I'll have some questions for them, and then we'll also do some audience questions. So if you have questions throughout the night, like Katie said, please do put them in the Q&A, and we will, later in the evening, we will get to the questions. Once we're taking questions, if you do want to unmute and let everyone hear your voice and ask, we're totally in favor of that. Too, I think you can raise your hand and we will unmute you. So to get started, I wanted to quickly introduce the two artists who are with us. So Chris Combs is an artist based in Washington, DC and Mount Rainier, Maryland, and he creates provocative technology. His first solo exhibition, Judging Me, Judging You, at DC Art Center, explored themes of surveillance and control, and his installation, Maelstrom at Rhizome DC, featured 35 machines spreading rumors about its visitors. His recent projects include Madness Method, a large-scale collaboration with David Greenfield Boyce, which took place as part of the Georgetown Globe Public Art Festival in 2021. He was selected as the Derek Liu Spring 2020 Artist in Residence at Hole in the Sky, is a recipient of the DCCAH Arts and Humanities Fellowship, and was shortlisted for the 2021 Aesthetic Art Prize. Chris is a graduate of the Corcoran College of Art and Design and a member of the Otis Street Arts Project. And then Evan Hume is also here with us tonight, lives and works in South Bend, Indiana, where he is the visiting lecturer of photography at the University of Notre Dame. Evan received his BFA from Virginia Commonwealth University and his MFA from George Washington University. He was raised in the Washington, DC area, and his approach to photography is informed by the experience of living in the nation's political center for much of his life, and focuses on the medium's use as an instrument of the national security state, which he will talk to us more about tonight. He has exhibited widely, and his work has been featured by publications including Aperture and Dare Grief. And Evan's first monograph, Viewing Distance, will be published by Daylight Books in the fall of 2021. So thanks to Chris and Evan for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Chris just to give us a little bit of an introduction to his work in the show.
Hi, everyone. Blair, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really happy to be a part of this show. I know that, being part of something bureaucratic is not always a highlight of someone's life, but for me it is. I'm very happy to be part of Take a Number. So I'm going to share my screen here in 1 second. I'm in my studio at Otis Street Arts Project right now. So let me fire up my slides. Okay. So this is me. You already got that. Okay, so this is my installation Data World 2021, booth number 313, Maelstrom Networks Incorporated. So that's a bit of a mouthful. It is the imagined trade show booth for a fictional data management company named Maelstrom. It includes the usual sort of marketing materials that you might see at an industry-specific conference, such as a box for leaving your business card for a sales follow-up, and custom pens and fun stuff like that. The installation also includes 15 working machines. They gather information about the real visitors in the gallery, and they visibly and audibly spread it among themselves. They're mostly all attached to a large PVC panel display here. I imagine that this company, Maelstrom, has a few different product lines: enterprise products for profile management, business to consumer products intended for small businesses to help them capture information about potential customers, and then direct consumer products, which might help you keep your own memory banks. So here are some examples of sort of light industrial products that might be used in a business to consumer sense, sort of using the aesthetic of things you might find in a garage or a small realtor company. And then you can see each of the devices kind of discussing with each other you. So they sense things about you. I'll get a little bit more into that in just a second here, but the kind of main ways that they communicate are through text scrolling by on the screens or by speaking in a very sort of monotonous and chilling text-to-speech way. There's also a fair amount of sort of signage in there just to complete the feel of it being like a trade show booth that someone just stepped away from. These are examples of how it sort of speaks about you. So there's this sort of tone to the text, which is not entirely on brand for how a real data management company might do things. Like Meta or Facebook, they're actually sort of trying to not freak you out, but I'm using text that is written in a little bit more of a conspiracy theorist kind of way. So there's sort of creepy things that it says, and it talks about your home address in ways that should be a little bit distressing and fun things like that. But these are sort of examples of the ways that things are shown on some of the devices. It's looking for things that are sent by your phone. So at all times, your phone is walking, or like when you're walking around with your phone, it's saying, hey, is there a Wi-Fi network named My Home Network? And that's actually a thing that your phone sends out to the world around you. And what's interesting is that if you're listening, you can hear those. They're called probe requests. It's something that you can capture. And so my machines do. They try to observe the name of home networks or other networks that your phone is attempting to connect to. If you also join the special Maelstrom public network, just to gain access to the network, it asks you to fill out a few questions, which happen to be things like, oh, I don't know, what's your favorite color? What's your middle name? What's your mother's maiden name? Nice, fun things like that. I see it as sort of like an extension of what we go through every time we connect to the Wi-Fi at the airport. And then there are also a couple other ways that you can provide information, like this machine here, which has an attached credit card and driver's license scanner. So you can scan your credit card and it will spread your name throughout the installation and also the last 4 digits of your account number. And you can scan your driver's license. There's a 2D barcode on the back of most of those, which encodes everything on the front and then some. So things like your organ donor status and what your eye color is, and nice calming things like that. How are they made? They're a bunch of different materials. I have gotten some kind of things that are intended to be made into machines, commercial enclosures, like steel boxes. In other cases, I modify things like an ever-ready battery charger. I carved it up and made it into a different looking machine. And some of them are also 3D printed and fabricated. I think I have a few pieces that are milled too. Their innards are also my creations. I design electronics. I design circuit boards, lay out schematics, all that good stuff. And I have blank circuit boards made to my specifications. I then assemble them in my studio by soldering a bunch of tiny things like these. I don't know if you can see the little dots there, but those are tiny components that are 1.2 by 2.0 millimeters in size. So I solder those onto all these circuit boards using a magical substance called solder paste and a fancy oven. This is all sort of an evolution of an earlier installation, which Blair mentioned in the introduction. This was previously an installation at Rhizome, DC, which was a larger number of machines in a very creepy, dark environment that I imagined to be the corporate museum of the company Maelstrom. And so this newer installation, Data World 2021, booth number 313, is a more polished view. It includes newer machines that are a little glossier, perhaps easier to sell at a trade show. And of course, a bunch of the sort of trappings of, trade shows and technology marketing. So I built out things like what's called a step and repeat backdrop, that big thing behind me in the photo. So just kind of laying that all out, designing it. And on the left-hand side, the printed PVC panel, I had a print shop do up a blank panel and bolted all these machines onto it. And then the frame around it too, I designed and constructed that out of a wonderful substance called aluminum extrusion, which is a little bit like, I don't know, sort of like a Lincoln Logs, Tinker, whatever. It's a fun substance. I would encourage anyone to look into aluminum extrusion. There's also a bit of lighting technology, which you can see lighting my stomach in the photo, but it's used to make the logo kind of light up a bit. There are business cards and the signage I mentioned, custom pens. I think there are still some pens left. So if you happen to stop by the installation, you should definitely feel free to grab yourself a pen and leave a business card in the box to, for further follow-up from a Maelstrom Network sales rep to help, identify synergies for your KPIs. So why am I doing all of this? I think that we share information in ways that are totally unintuitive to us. Like, take those Facebook memes, like elf name generator here. If you see people commenting on here saying what their elf name is, they've also revealed their birthday, which is a bit of a security problem in some contexts. It's used as a security question. It can, be used for identity theft and all kinds of fun things like that. But you wouldn't imagine that by sharing your elf name on a Facebook post that you're actually leaking that kind of data about yourself, unless you actually take a second to think about it, or you're already onto the ruse. There are other things sort of analogous to this, like just by using free apps on our phone, you're leaking your location data. These apps request background location data, which, what does that matter, right? But any app the creator of the app can have an agreement with the data management platform that aggregates and sells all of the data of all the people who use the app. And then all of that is packaged up and neatly redistributed through other data platforms. These things are used in kind of wild ways. So you can have corporations doing warrantless searches, like Uber's GodView, which was used to track journalists who are writing critically about their platform. Governments and law enforcement officials. I mean, the sort of classic example of that is Stingray, which was really just sort of intercepting cell phones' attempts to communicate with their home networks. And you can also just buy this location data these days. I'm under the impression that it's well under $100. It's something you can just do on the open internet, and you can just buy massive packages of the location data of any particular individual. And in fact, just found out today, I think through maybe the Washington Post reporting, that a company called Veriset released a massive data set of everyone in Washington, D.C. Their cell phone location information was provided by this company, Veriset, to the DC government for the purpose of doing research about COVID-19 for like a 3-month period. Everyone with a 202 phone number, cell phone, just released this entire data set to the DC government, which was then stored and distributed throughout DC government data retention, mechanics. Kind of wild. That's a lot of information that could be used in a lot of different ways. And the laws governing the use of this stuff are totally ineffectual in this country in particular. I mean, there are some attempts in Europe, the GDPR, to do some regulation of how data is managed and used, but it's fairly ineffectual, I would say. And I am also sort of interested in the way that these surveillance technologies are used by marketers. So marketing technology, or MarTech companies, make some pretty wild assumptions about us based off of what I would call a weak signal. So for instance, if you Google search Lexus, you're not really saying necessarily that I am going to go buy a car, but that is the group that you'll be put into. You are then in a category of people who are interested in potentially buying a car. And that's something that is useful to Google. It can be sold to advertisers who also find it useful, and a whole plethora of companies in between. So these sort of fairly weak data points are used as methods of revenue generation by a whole lot of different companies. And there isn't really like an incentive for this data to be all that good. Like, I'm sure you've all had the experience of shopping for something on some kind of internet bookseller and finding ads for that very same product following you around the internet, even after perhaps you bought it. So there isn't really necessarily an incentive for the ad technology companies here to be doing a really good job of weeding out people who've already purchased it, say. And these profiles are just sold at massive scale. And I personally can't help but think of a more dystopian future where these things could have ramifications for people seeking a job. Let's say you searched for edibles for some reason. Could a private employer then find that out and use it to, affect whether you get a job with them or not? I don't know. I don't see why not. And border passages, there's certainly, I could imagine some countries or agencies being very interested in your, sort of marketing segments. Or what if you are denied asylum or bail based off of this? And these factors could also be ingredients in the predictive policing algorithms that are already in use in, say, Florida. So, bigger picture, in the real world, in meat space, when you touch something, I think you sort of understand what will happen. When you talk to somebody, you have an idea of what will occur. I don't think that we have a very good idea of what really happens when we interact in online. And when are we not online anymore? Like the devices in our pockets are continuously online. And I think that we don't fully understand the ramifications of this, and that search for Lexus, or whatever, that stuff, we don't really understand the effects that these things can have on our futures. They can be stored indefinitely and have all kinds of, interesting ramifications for us. So through my work, I'm really kind of interested in helping update our mental models of how we interact with the world. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. That was really, a great introduction to the project. Great. Evan, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Thanks, Blair and Chris, and hey, everybody, and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm going to share my screen and give an overview of the images that I've got in the exhibition and give some kind of historical background and a bit about my process. So the work I have in the exhibition is from my series Viewing Distance, which compiles and transforms material from US government archives to examine photography as a tool of the military-industrial complex for surveillance, reconnaissance, and documentation of advanced technologies. And many of the source images date back to the mid-20th century, early Cold War era, but they've only recently been declassified, and a lot of information still remains secret. So these images sort of represent the decades-long time delay from when knowledge comes into being and then when it becomes publicly accessible, if it ever does. Some of the images I've used in my work are already, deliberately concealed, while others have been altered by repeated reproduction during their time in the archives. I first began obtaining photographs and other documents through Freedom of Information Act requests and searching through government archives as a grad student at George Washington University. And the photographs and documents I encountered during my research led me to the direct relationship between photography's technological development in the 20th century and the expansion of the US national security state, and then of course, continuing on into the 21st century. So a little bit of kind of historical background. The emergence of Soviet nuclear capabilities in 1949 was the cause of great alarm in the US. And the so-called bomber gap, which was this unfounded notion that the USSR had surpassed the US in its arsenal of bomber jets, was used to justify increased defense spending and the buildup of a bomber fleet by the US Air Force. And then by the 1950s, President Eisenhower and his national security officials believed that innovations in aerial photo reconnaissance were necessary to accurately assess Soviet weapons capabilities, right? So, there had been aerial photo reconnaissance in World War II, mostly for mapping, determining targets, and then assessing damage after bombing raids. So, you know, they knew that the US knew that it would need to make some technological leaps forward in both camera systems and aviation to kind of achieve this goal, right? Which was to capture images of Warsaw Pact military installations while avoiding detection by Soviet radar systems to assess their weapons capabilities. So the result of this was, you know, significant development in aerial imaging, as well as high altitude and high speed aircraft like the U-2 and Oxcart spy planes, which were created by a partnership between government agencies, corporations, and academia, which we now commonly refer to as the military industrial complex. So in this particular instance, it included the Lockheed Corporation, Kodak, Edwin Land, who was the founder of Polaroid and the inventor of instant film, Harvard scientists, and of course, the US Air Force and Central Intelligence Agency. So these aerial photo reconnaissance development projects, you know, resulted in these high altitude supersonic jets with camera systems capable of image resolutions more than 200 times greater than any previously existing camera, and included lenses designed with the aid of computer algorithms, even in the 1950s into the 1960s. And so this would pave the way for satellite imaging, which would kind of you know, be the successor going into the 1960s, and then drone imaging, right? So those two technologies, satellite and drone imaging, that kind of now define image-based intelligence gathering. So after years of accumulating photographs pertaining to military and intelligence gathering operations, I began to experiment with various methods of combining and transforming images to animate this archival material, as well as emphasize this tension that I found between images that were informational and then others that were very enigmatic or completely redacted within the archives. And the processes I use, you know, include analog printing, digital collage, scanner manipulation, data bending. And through this disruption and layering, I want to show these historical fragments in a state of flux and kind of open to alternate associations and implications. The idea being that what we're allowed to know and see is often incomplete and indeterminate, which encourages kind of critical speculation. So exposing these gaps in a part of photography's history, which I think has been underexplored and overlooked to an extent, and then gaps in Cold War history as well, and thinking about the way that the past now inhabits the present. You know, I feel like as a child of the late 80s, World War II and the Cold War were kind of the origin story for the world that I was born into. And so I'm interested in evaluating the sort of gaps or the missing pieces, the fragments that are left from that narrative of the Cold War and its lingering impact on our current geopolitical situation. And so those images I just cycled through are the ones included in Take a Number. And just to give you a sense as well of some of the more obfuscated and redacted images that I encountered that are also part of this body of work. Top secret file, only released within, you know, the last few years, but it is a photograph pertaining to satellite photo reconnaissance during the Cold War. Redacted file pertaining to the Minuteman missile. This is a Air Force document where the folder is obscuring the photographs inside of it, and the label has been redacted. And a document released in 2017 from a National Reconnaissance Office publication called the Space Sentinel. This was from a summer 2010 issue, which you can see is heavily redacted, but I'll read the little bit of text here, which says, redacted, the benefit of high resolution imagery. While we can solve many intelligence problems using medium resolution imagery, we simply cannot resolve others without the benefit of high resolution collection. NGA analysts and scientists team with NRO experts to achieve information dominance over current and potential adversaries that significantly contribute to our combat edge. So I think that kind of sums up this kind of trajectory of photography's technological development being very much related to the expansion of the national security state and thus US global dominance. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Great, thanks, Evan. So as we were putting the show together and thinking about how to do artist talks, I liked the idea of pairing up some of the artists whose work in some ways is actually quite, the experience of viewing it is very different, but there's sort of a, thematic connections running throughout. And so I think Chris and Evan, your work in the show seems to have some interesting points where it was thematic points of contact, I guess. One of them being obviously the way the development of technology has been really tied to surveillance needs, whether that's government needs or the more market-driven needs of corporations, and also to some extent that separation being sort of not real, right? That in a lot of cases it's actually the surveillance needs are serving both, or the technologies are happening as sort of a public-private partnership kind of situation. But I was wondering how each of you kind of, I guess, sees that element of your work as the the technology, and that how much the either market for or government desire for surveillance has shaped it.
I'm happy to dive in first, if you don't mind. Yeah, I mean, it seems that so much of the modern advertising powered internet is contingent upon surveillance, but also things that seem more innocuous and good, like the ability to measure how well your software works, even things like Google Analytics, you can really capture quite a lot of information as someone making or providing a service or platform or app. And that's good to you, and the ramifications of how this stuff can then be used after it's captured and stored, that's a whole nother thing. And I'm not sure that there's necessarily this awareness of that from the creator side of things. That's interesting. And data can be forever. That's a really long time, So the surveilling of things for good purposes can then become, the sale of that data for less good purposes. And I think there's certainly been a lot of overlap with that in sort of a technological level, with surveillance technology then being used by the military and vice versa. So yeah, Evan, that might be a good point to throw over to you.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, I don't feel like I have uncovered this smoking gun or something through my research. The narrative has kind of always been there, even though there's a lot missing from the narrative. But it's striking to me how sort of overlooked this relationship has been between government, corporations, military industrial complex, whatever you want to call it, and where we've gotten to today with what our cameras are capable of, how we experience photography. From my perspective, this narrative that I kind of just summarized is the origin point of cybernetic photography. This Harvard scientist, James Baker, using a computer algorithm to make decisions about how lenses could be optimized and should be designed for these advanced aerial camera systems. With that in mind, it's very hard to imagine how we get to these cameras on our phones, digital photography, the way images circulate now, without that massive amount of funding being poured into research and development for surveillance needs. You know, Lyndon Johnson said about the satellite photography in the context of the space program is that, you know, we've spent $40 billion and it was worth it alone just for the photography, you know? So yeah, that narrative already existed, but it's still very interesting to me that it's something that's kind of overlooked and a kind of a big missing piece, I think, in the way that the history of photography is looked at and discussed.
Yeah, I mean, I think
And I
for,
think too.
I was going to say, I think for me, that narrative is very familiar when you talk about the space race and the development of, yeah, technology to go to space and how that had military implications. The development of the internet having like being connected to the military in its sort of, you know, initial research and what made it possible. But I studied photography in college and hadn't ever thought about, I think the history of photography that you learn, especially in a fine arts context, is completely divorced from that. And so it's sort of not, you know, maybe there's some other discipline where it's being discussed, but it's very separated from the normal sort of history narrative of the history of photography.
I think it's interesting too, like for a long time, you know, we people were sort of wrestling, we humans were wrestling with the sort of first order technology problems of this, of like how to get good photographs and like how to surveil and how to capture data. And it's almost like that's more of a solved problem now. And we all kind of know how to do it really, really well. And it makes me think like maybe the next thing will be the sort of second order application of these technologies. Like now that we have perfect captures of lots of things, how do you synthesize and use that data? And that's like a whole new scary frontier of, you know, things like neural networks being used to identify images with built-in, you know, biases from their training data. And how do we ethically employ mass, not only surveillance, but actually recognition within that surveillance? Like, what are we going to do with these things? And, you know, we're not off to a great start. I think that, you know, companies like Google hamstringing their own ethical AI initiative by firing Dr. Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell for, you know, refusing to alter their research because of their marketing department's demands. I don't think we're off to a great start with that. I don't know. Anything interesting in there, Evan?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, right now there's only so much speed with which we can make advancements in things like image sensors and lenses. And so I think, to your point, the way things are going is how much data can we pack into an image, right? How much sensory data can a photo capture rather than how high resolution an image we can capture, right? There's already kind of a trajectory for that, for making sensors with more and more megapixels. You know, we can find ways to make smaller and smaller lenses that are more advanced to fit on phones and things like that. But yeah, I think the trajectory is packing more and more data that's recorded by the camera, expanding the type of data that can be recorded by a camera, and trying to pack that into an image file.
Yeah, and to take it back a little bit to the work you're each making, you're both working with technology, but each sort of in an experimental way. So that's something that I was curious about too, just as far as, you know, how do you think about that as a material? Like it's a sort of, especially Chris, with your work, I think sometimes people are surprised to see these sort of objects or these sort of, I'm still sort of working out how to describe them to people, to be honest. Like, are they sculptures? Are they machines? Like, people are a little surprised to see them in the gallery. And then in your case, Evan, you know, you're creating these photographic prints that then hang on the wall. But the backstory of how you got to that point involves a lot of sort of experimentation and sort of, to some extent, I guess, with both of you, like corrupted use of certain technologies. So I was, yeah, is that, how do you each approach that in your work?
Sure, I can jump in with that. I think for me, the way I began to use technology in this body of work was to take inspiration from the types of things I was seeing while doing my research with archival images, or the sorts of images I would encounter. You know, haphazard scanner glitches, things being overly compressed, other kind of analog errors, like ripped pieces of paper or ripped prints, things that have been Xeroxed so many times that they become illegible, tape haphazardly applied, and documents stacked on top of one another. So that was kind of my entry point for this series. And it was the first time I really, I think, let myself loosen up a bit with the way I was using some imaging tools and image editing software. My previous work with images from government archives had been pretty straightforward kind of appropriation. My first body of work was from working in that way was UFO photographs from government archives. And I was interested in their abstract quality. So I just blew them up at large scale to emphasize that and to have them take on a bit of a new life. And so with this series, I took a lot of inspiration from the sorts of things I was encountering in the archives. And then that sort of led me to the possibilities of different ways I could alter the image digitally, like with my supersonic jet images. I'm importing those into audio software. The images are bitmaps that I bring into the audio software. I run audio filters over them like echo or delay, and then export them as a raw file, put them back into a bitmap. And it doesn't always work. Sometimes they're just like these crunchy looking black and white images that are just kind of a bunch of lines and pixels. But when they do work, for me, it was a way of injecting a sense of energy and movement, because these supersonic jets are captured with these fast shutter speeds and they look floating and kind of still. So transforming the image in that way was, I guess, another visual representation in the way I was thinking about this parallel development of really advanced camera systems, really fast, high-flying spy planes, and using the two together for surveillance purposes. So I think the way I kind of navigated technology with this series was actually fairly intuitive, which was uncharacteristic of me up until that point. But yeah.
Evan, that audio bending stuff is so cool. That's such a good idea.
Thank you.
Feeding images through audio filters. I'm all about that. That's
yeah,
cool.
I think it's opened up a whole new, I think, path for me. So interested to see where it goes.
Yeah, mine it. Do it. And then I guess for me with the sort of experimental side of things, I mean, I've always sort of aspired to having objects that seem sort of enchanted or magical. And I've recognized that Data World, Booth 313, Maelstrom Networks Incorporated, does not necessarily seem like good magic. But I do like the idea of having objects that are just unexpectedly interactive or change over time without being like a form that you would recognize as a computer. So like almost everything on the wall behind me has like a computer in it, but doesn't really look like a computer. So I kind of enjoy that just in terms of the formal aspects of like experimenting with the form. But with the actual sort of software, particularly with Maelstrom and Data World, the process of just making the engineering work well enough was like very experimental for me, but I was just solved problems. Like these are things that actual developers and like serious technologists would just be able to do because they'd studied how to do it. And for me, it was a process of reading a lot of how-to guides and Stack Overflow, Googling and all that good stuff. I use DuckDuckGo, by the way, not Google. And just sort of experimenting my way through these already solved problems let me do some kind of fun things with it. Like each of the machines in Data World and Maelstrom, and each of these like guys over my shoulder here, the pink ones, they all have radios in them. They communicate with each other over these radios. It's sort of like Bluetooth. And when I was like setting this up, I learned a lot about how to use the radios, and I realized that I could turn off most of the error correction, which then meant that things would come through in kind of a garbled way. And that's actually kind of fun with the Maelstrom devices, because I want them to reflect this sort of rumor mill, like virality, like conspiracy theory kind of language. And so having them immediately get something wrong and then spread that rumor among themselves is a lot of fun. I really like that. And that's just something that I figured out by messing around with the kind of lower level, settings of the radio chipsets that I use. They're Nordic Semiconductor Nerf 24 LO1 pluses, if you're curious. But just being able to mess around with these kind of settings and controls that you don't usually have until you build your own software from the ground up, I've really enjoyed doing that.
Yeah, and that actually gets Chris to another question I was thinking about for both of you, which is, I mean, the machines you've built, Chris, are real, like they do what they say they do, like they are real, functional. There's a sort of weird line with art of like, is it an art object or is it a machine that does the thing it says it does, or sort of both? And so this line between the real and the fictional in both of your work. So Chris, that you've built these real machines as part of this project that is a fictional company. And then Evan, you're incorporating these, actual images you found, but sort of, manipulating them in a way to kind of heighten the sort of, I don't want to say mystery, but to sort of heighten the sort of unknowability and the sort of the tensions that are there, from not quite seeing everything, I guess. But is that something that each of you have thought about in terms of your work, where that line is between truth and fiction?
I mean, it's certainly like not my work, but the minimum wage machine is an example of something that does exactly what it says on the tin. And it's art. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there's a hard line there. I guess to me, if it asks more questions than it answers, to me that makes it art. But,
yeah, I'm not the fact that
yeah.
it's a thing that does what it says it does, means it isn't art, just that's there's always sort of a weird question of like, if you're creating an art piece and you say something's an installation that's a grocery store, like, is it an actual place where you can go and purchase food, or is it yeah, so it can be go either way, sort of elements of both, I think.
Yeah, I think,
absolutely.
I think, like Chris said, the work raising questions is a big part of it, and any attempt to answer them is speculation, and that speculation could bring you one step closer to the truth, or it could bring you one step closer to something that's fiction. So I think that's the way I kind of think about it. You're absolutely right, Blair, that for me, the transformation of the images, it's kind of highlight the mystery, the indeterminacy, and also that tension between things that are partially legible, things that are, obfuscated, and sort of feeling like you're hitting a wall when you maybe try to interpret them or get some kind of definite knowledge out of them.
And Evan, I was sort of curious, like your work makes me wonder how you decide how much to tell people. Like how much is in the caption, like how much do you want the viewer to know or wonder about?
Yeah, that was definitely something I had to think about with the book, because I thought, well, do I put a plate list in there that lists the titles? How important is that? And I decided to kind of balance out that transformation that the images were going through, or to balance out that, or I guess maybe to maintain that balance between indeterminate and legible. The titles kind of function that way. I think for some of them, it's very straightforward. It's kind of referencing the source material where the image came from. With others, I don't have a whole lot of context. I might encounter images where there's no title, there's no accompanying text document, no useful metadata, and so I might go with something a little more evocative, or refer to something that's legible within the image, kind of lead the viewer a little bit towards something in the picture.
Mhm. We have some audience questions already, so I want to jump to those, get those into. Chris, I think this was for you. Zane was asking, I think when you were discussing the algorithms behind a lot of the ad tech kind of technology, can your average person throw the algorithms and companies following them, or is this a space that won't easily be thrown off?
I think it's a mixture of both. You can definitely have some fun with it, like if you want to have a different profile, you can actually, in some cases, like I think both Google, Twitter, and all three, Google, Facebook, and Twitter in particular, let you see what it thinks about you. So you can see your advertiser profile, your advertising profile, and see which interest segments you're in. And that's fabulous. Like it, in my case, like identified me on Twitter. I think Twitter had identified me as a 50 to 59-year-old, which I will be someday, but not yet. And had all kinds of interests that I do not consider interests, specific sports figures, which I don't know who they are, but it feels that I do and love them. I think that you can definitely lead them a bit. What effect this will ultimately have, I don't know. Most of these things, at least in the advertising realm, the ad tech world, they kind of age out after 30 days. So if you make a habit of it, yeah. And I would highly encourage doing that. It'll be fun. If nothing else, you'll get some really interesting ads.
Cool. And another question for both of you. Has your artistic work and research influenced your daily life? So for example, how you interact with social media or how you think about the government?
Do it, Evan.
Okay.
How
Well,
you think about UFOs?
yeah. I don't know if it's necessarily affected the way I think about or interact with social media. I don't think anybody considers me to be much of a threat. And you know, with the government, I feel like I kind of treat it like if anybody wants to find out information about me, they probably can. So I don't,
Amen.
I don't worry about it too much. Where I think where my main interest lies more so with my work is historical concerns, and kind of the past illuminating the present and how that kind of relates to our current kind of geopolitical picture. I think that's kind of what I think about on a more daily basis in relation to my work personally.
And then from my end, I mean, I used to work in media doing the kind of sort of adjacent to the money-making operations. So I guess I had been exposed to a lot of these kind of creepier technologies a while ago. And so it's a little bit of the chicken and the egg there. Like I think I learned about the creepy things and started making art about that. So in some ways, these were things that I was already creeped out by. But I could certainly, I mean, it's been helpful to learn more about the mechanics of it and just kind of keep on the beat. And I'm really interested in learning more about and working more with the way that, neural networks and quote unquote artificial intelligence are changing the way that the internet functions, and will continue to. And I don't want to bring up this topic, but crypto and NFTs, which don't do NFTs, please. There's definitely going to be some interesting changes. I mean, what's this Reddit business, with suddenly they're going to be minting NFTs based off of your social score on the platform? That makes me think of the way some world governments keep a social score of each individual person. That's interesting. Not necessarily great, but interesting.
Yeah, anything that sounds like a plot line from a dystopian book or movie is a little concerning. That actually also relates to one of the other questions we've gotten from Anne. If you see your work further forecasting the possible future trajectories of the technologies you're talking about, which Chris seems like that's a little bit of that direction, maybe a little bit of where we're going.
Yeah, what I would say is that I hope not. it's, I mean, these are things that already exist, and what's much like the surveillance, shown in your work, Evan, like these are things that currently are being done, and what's the only thing is that no one knows that, or like people don't widely understand it. So in some ways, it's not so much the future as the present. Like these are things that you can do. You can buy your neighbor's location history for under $100. So I guess the sort of trajectory that I want to address is I would love to kind of improve the trajectory a little bit. And I recognize activism is like a somewhat adjacent but different thing from many artists' practices, but I would certainly be on board with getting stronger rights for our electronic privacy. And there are a number of area nonprofits doing amazing work with this.
And I think for me, one of the things that I hope, somebody looking at my work will think about is, to go back to something I had mentioned earlier, right, is this time delay from when knowledge or information comes into being, and then when, if ever, we as the public can access it and know it. Which I hope encourages maybe people to think about, well, what sorts of things are being developed and done now that we don't know about, that we may or may not learn about decades from now. And I think it also, in terms of like thinking about the future as well, I think there are certain things you might be able to speculate on based on what we know about the past and technologies that have been developed or technologies that are being used now. So, for me, I'm influenced by Walter Benjamin's idea of salvaging the debris of history, right? And thinking about how images of the past can illuminate the present, because the past is embedded in the present. And I think if that's true, then the future is also embedded in the present. So we can get sort of, I think, glimpses of the way things are heading by what we might be able to figure out, or what we might have access to in terms of knowledge now, or at least thinking about the fact that there's a lot going on right now that we just don't know about because we're not allowed to know about it.
Yeah, the question of time in both of your works, I think, is just in the sense that, Chris, your work dealing with things that are, very contemporary, happening right now. Evan, you're looking at these historical records, but that kind of oversimplifies it, right? Like you're each, there's sort of a lag on technology, or there's also a lag that, Evan, like you've pointed out, on when this information sort of gets spread, or when technologies get spread. And so there's sort of, it all blends into one another, and the technology isn't always, it's not necessarily always the most cutting edge technology that's the most pernicious, maybe perhaps as well. I don't know if either of you would agree with that. It seems to kind of stick around for a while. And
Yeah, it's almost like the brute force application of sort of simple technologies are what really get us into these sort of jams. Like I think of Palantir, which is a really interesting company doing surveillance for hire, or really sort of connection making for hire. My understanding of the business is that they will ingest like massive quantities, sort of like legal discovery. They'll just ingest everything they can find on given networks, like file shares, like a company's file shares, all their like email accounts, all that stuff, just vacuum it all in, and then just parse everything, like work out like, okay, let's open up this Word document automatically and find all the keywords that relate between these documents, and then form these sort of connections. And that's not necessarily like, each of these chunks is not, sorry, Palantir, particularly like new or novel. It's more the connection making there, just like actually doing the sort of grunt work that made that into a somewhat scary company worth a lot of money. I think there's something there. Yeah, like it's not necessarily the cutting edge stuff, but just the like couple generations back being applied in bulk, which now we're looking at, like neural networks analyzing like all this stuff that we've been capturing for however long. Like that's interesting, and not, and a little bit scary.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think a lot of it is about the operation and application of the technology. I mean, I've got a drone with a 4K video camera attached to it right next to me right now. And, you know, I doubt a drone flying over Yemen right now is capturing something higher than 4K. And so maybe, I don't know. But I think, you know, there's definitely this, I think, alignment that often happens where what we're able to access as consumers maybe actually is the best technology that there is in terms of maybe image capturing to some extent, but it's the scope of the application that I think really sets it apart.
Ring doorbells.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
Are there other audience questions for Chris or Evan? We did get one question, Chris, for you. Will Maelstrom be making any appearances in area trade shows?
It's an interesting question. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Well, thanks to both of you for being here with us tonight and for participating in the exhibition. I really appreciate it. It's been great to work with both of you and have you in the show. Like I said before, I always say this a million times at virtual events. If you're in the area, please do come and see the exhibition in person. It's up through December 18th. And we'll be doing 2 more artist talks as part of the show. So one next Thursday and another the following Saturday. So hope to see some people again. And thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much, everybody. This was amazing. Thank you,
Thanks,
Blair.
everyone.
Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, Chris and Blair.
Yep. All right. Have a good night, everybody.